Welcome. It's great to see everybody joining us this evening from around the country and around the world. All eyes have been on the United States for the last several weeks due to the US presidential election. And just by way of a short introduction on the center's work and then leading into tonight's discussion, as an organization that studies the health of American democracy, we found that in some regards, this election was actually quite a good news story. We were prepared for significant violence, disruption on election day and around the counting. And what we observed was largely a very orderly process of Americans participating in record numbers in the election, an account process that was, though, longer than normal in terms of getting to an announceable set of results, proceeded with a diligent count. Not everybody agrees. No, not everybody likes the outcomes. That's true of any election. Not everybody agrees on my assessment of it, but generally speaking, we felt like this was a pretty good signal to the world that the United States is very capable of running democratic elections and expressing the will of Americans and the outcomes of those elections, with the caveats that you all have been watching in the news. Our organization for the last several years has been doing significant work studying incentives in American politics. Basically, we were trying to unpack why it is that Congress has such a hard time achieving the basic level of bipartisan cooperation required by our system to get things done, like keep the lights on and not shut the government down when they reach the end of the budgetary year, which unfortunately is happening more and more often. And looked at some of the reasons that our political system seems to incentivize politicians to demonize each other and not compromise versus compromise enough to have our government function in a basic way that most citizens say they want. This year, we turned a lot of our efforts to election mechanisms and essentially just trying to protect public faith in our election systems, in the ability of voters to participate in various ways, especially because of the COVID pandemic, whether by mail using absentee balloting methodology or showing up in person, trying to emphasize there were strong bipartisan voices encouraging people to participate, that the system was safe and largely fraud-free. And that became a big challenge message-wise this year. So it's something we focused on. But I thought about some of the things that we've seen in the news this year from the perspective, and I encourage you to think about it from the perspective of stress testing democracy. In other words, we looked at the COVID challenge, everything that came associated with that in terms of economic shutdowns and mask requirements and public health questions, and tried to ask ourselves, did our democracy prove itself resilient? Were our political actors able to come together to help the country come to, if not a consensus, some reasonable set of shared agreements on pathways to deal with this crisis? We also saw a lot of unrest and protests resulting from police killings of American citizens this year. And I also tried to ask, did our system do a good job of processing a challenging set of issues and helping Americans come together to get closer to a consensus on how to respond to these challenges, or did we get further apart? I'll leave it to you to decide how you feel like the democracy's done. Of course, all this is happening during a presidential election year. So I like to try to ask myself, what would have happened if these things had happened in a non-election year, when we weren't hyper-focused on the winning of a campaign? I don't know whether things would have been a lot different. What we've seen through this presidency is a continuation of trends that existed prior to it in terms of politicizing events, even outside of what we would call election years. And we think that that's a troubling trend. We're hoping to contribute to a reversal of that trend in the future. But as to what happened this year, how COVID and the related challenges and challenges of police violence affected and impacted the elections, where we saw a Democratic candidate win the presidency, but Republicans gain in both houses of Congress. As to what that all means and what it tells us about where we're going from here, you have an all-star cast, as Erica mentioned, of experts to talk you through that tonight. So I won't keep you any longer from them, but let me just introduce the moderator of tonight's conversation, Clyde McGrady. Clyde McGrady joined the Washington Post in October of 2020 as a style feature writer, covering race, identity, and the ideas and cultural shifts shaping our world. Before the Post, he wrote for Heard on the Hill section of Roll Call, where he covered the personal side of congressional politics, including interviews with Black lawmakers about giving and receiving the talk, and stories about Black-owned small businesses seeking federal coronavirus aid. McGrady's stories at Roll Call also included a deep dive into how a 1992 murder rocked Capitol Hill, a look at the bizarre world of MAGA rap and the trials and tribulations of a Hill staffer named Taylor Swift. Very interesting stuff. Clyde McGrady, thank you for agreeing to be our moderator tonight. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Glenn, for that lovely introduction, and thank you guys for having me. Very excited to be here and and break down the aftermath of the 2020 elections. Well, supposed aftermath. Anyway, I just want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. First is Laura Barón-López, who's a national political reporter for Politico, and also a political analyst for CNN. She covered the 2020 presidential race and also helped lead coverage of the pandemic's impact on different racial and ethnic groups. Next, we have Stad Herndon with the New York Times, where he is a national political reporter and another analyst for CNN. He covered the 2020 elections, and before that, he was an integral part of the Times midterm coverage team, with a special emphasis on grassroots campaigning and stories about race and identity. And before that, he was at the Washington Bureau and a City Hall reporter for the Boston Globe. Next up, Jessica Taylor. She's a Senate and Governor's editor with the Cook Political Report. Before Cook, Taylor was a political reporter for NPR for 5 years, where she covered elections and breaking news, ranging from the White House to both chambers of Congress and statewide elections. She was also a contributing author to the 2020 edition of the Almanac of American Politics. And finally, we have Tia Mitchell, who is the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's Washington correspondent, my home state paper. In this role, she writes about Georgia's congressional delegations, campaigns, elections, and the impact that decisions made in DC have on the residents in the Peach State. Before that, she was the AJC's DeKalb County reporter. And before that, before joining the AJC in 2017, she spent her entire career in Florida, covering local and state government for publications like the Tampa Bay Times and the Florida Times-Union. Thank you so much, panel, for being here. You scholars are very lucky to have these four political minds here to talk about these issues. So I guess the first question I want to start with, who is the demographic group most responsible for Joe Biden's victory, and who is the demographic group to blame for the Democrats underperforming at the congressional level? Please, anyone jump in.
Oh my God. I don't.
I mean, I'm kind of joking, but yeah, in the aftermath,
I mean, it varies by state, right? I don't think you can say one demographic group across the board, put Biden over the top in every state, or one, didn't. I mean, each state tells a different story. Like in Arizona, which is a state that I was heavily focused on throughout the cycle, The reason that that state flipped for the first time since 1996 with Bill Clinton was a mixture of shifting attitudes among white voters in the suburbs of Phoenix, among seniors, which is something that we also latched onto relatively early. Politico did. Seniors were upset about COVID, and then also because of the Latino electorate in Arizona. So that mixture is what helped push Biden over the top. So even though, in certain areas, Trump may be gained by marginal percentage points with different Latino subgroups because of the overall turnout, Biden still won a majority of the share. So that's Arizona, but I want to let the others jump in because it's a very different story if you look at Pennsylvania or if you look at Georgia.
Yeah, I'll jump in about Georgia. Some stuff is similar. For example, the seniors and in the Atlanta suburbs, the shifting attitudes on Trump, particularly by college-educated white voters. That was a big difference because Joe Biden is poised to carry Georgia. There's still some recounting going on, but Joe Biden's going to win Georgia. And for Georgia, it's the first time a Democrat has won in a presidential race since 1992. Bill Clinton won Georgia once and didn't win Georgia for his second term. Of course, in Georgia, you have support from Black voters. You also do have support from Latino voters and particularly in the Atlanta suburbs, Asian voters and immigrants. So, but I think if you're going to give the prize to one demographic in Georgia, it would be college-educated white voters who soured on Donald Trump.
Estad? Mute.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just reject the premise of the question. I think that all of these things are additive rather than zero sum. So to take Tia's example in Georgia, you certainly have the biggest change from 2016 to 2020 being a college affluent, a suburban voter who soured on Trump. But if you don't get the kind of Black share and Black turnout, if you don't get the Black turnout increasing in the way that it did, then that doesn't matter. That matters in a different way, right? If you don't get the increase of Latino and AAPI voters here, that matters in a certain way. Obviously, if you look at other states, the equation's different. Out in Florida, Joe Biden did some of the things among seniors that we're talking about, but the real erosion, particularly in the kind of Miami area, hurt him. Or if you look at Texas, along those border communities, an erosion there hurts him, even as he's doing better in the Dallas suburbs. So I think that like in each one of these states, there is a complicated story to be told. The question though about the second half of the question, when we're saying about who's responsible or who for the kind of way the House and Senate districts works, I think that's also a complicated one. But what we do know about those districts is that those House districts are gerrymandered. Those are drawn Republican maps that kind of overemphasize a type of white conservative voter or Republican leaning district in a lot of these most competitive places. And so what you saw was the real surge of turnout increase. That was the most unexpected thing from the election coming from the conservative side, really impact Democrats on that Senate and congressional level. And so if you have a kind of stable turnout, like kind of what we were predicting on that level, Democrats probably do get the landslide results that they're looking for when you look down ballot. But because that surge happened and because the way those maps are drawn, that allowed Republicans to make back some of those gains in those places. So, I mean, I think that it's a complicated story across the country that has pockets in which people can pull out and kind of affirm, one demographic group on one side or the other. Certainly Trump made some inroads with some non-white groups that he wasn't that were hoping on. But the turnout increased, so Joe Biden looked well. So it's just a mess, is what my answer is on the line.
Yeah, and I'll jump in a little bit on that. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. That I do think it's a bit early to draw sweeping conclusions, because I will say, some of the exit polls that we look at, they're going to be adjusted. So I guess I'm also still a skeptic of all exit polling as sort of, gospel just 2 weeks out until we see it adjusted a little bit. But I mean, Black women continue to be the base of the party. And I think that's why it was so important for Joe Biden, especially after the summer's events, to put a Black woman on the ticket. And then it's white men that are, and especially non-college white men that are Trump's base. And we did see that shift, certainly, as Tia mentioned, certainly in the Atlanta suburbs. But it's also showing us that these groups are not monolithic when it comes to different states, that you had, Trump running stronger with Latinos in the Miami area that are more of Cuban descent than you did Latinos in Arizona, and the seniors in Florida are different, very different from seniors in Arizona. So, it differs certainly congressional as well, but state by state too. But I think the biggest shift that we've seen over the past 4 years is the shift of white college educated women that are in those suburbs. And I think a lot depends on both the direction the Republican Party takes and the direction the Democratic Party takes. I had one strategist that mentioned to me sort of early, back a couple of months ago, Democratic strategists, are we just renting these voters, or do we own them now? Has Trump turned them so far off of the Republican Party that they're gone? Or could, a different type of candidate bring them sort of back into the fold? So I think I'm looking at, a little bit more forward, and what does the next candidate, it could still be Trump in 2024. He's certainly going to tease out there that he's going to run. And what does the electorate look like? We see the 2022 midterms that are typically bad for the president's party, and we're going to have redistricting thrown in there as well in the House. So I think it's a lot of factors to consider, but you certainly, I think, did see, Black voters have been the core that I think, Joe Biden knows the nomination to, especially after South Carolina primary as well.
So Jessica, that actually leads right into my next question. You talked about, the exit data, and that is very preliminary. So, people take it with a grain of salt. But do you buy into the notion that there was, on the margin, some progress that Trump made with non-white voters? And, this is something that I've seen. I think it's come more from the right, that there is this a depolarization around race, ironically, that Trump kind of ushered in, and that the kind of the more significant divide, I guess, will become education. Do you buy into that?
I do. I think education is one of the most significant factors that we see of how these voters are voting and are sort of sorting themselves. I do think there's evidence that Trump made some inroads with Latino voters, like I mentioned there, sort of in Florida, and perhaps non-college Black men as well. So I think that education we were just seeing that as a dividing line across the country. But I think that, and as you all are here, as part of your colleges and things too, I think that's one thing I've been struck by, of the past 4 years too, is just that the way that you have some people that talk about, getting an education as though it's a bad thing. To me, I was the first in my family to go to college, and it was something I was really proud of, something my parents were really proud of. And, now I go back home sometimes, and I'm from rural Tennessee, and it's like, oh, well, you just went to college and you got liberalized, or you're part of the evil mainstream media now too. And I think the way that Trump talks about these dividing lines, which is ironic as well, because, he likes to talk about how he went to an Ivy League school and went to Wharton and stuff. So you would not think of Donald Trump as being, this sort of, blue collar person, but he's been able to tap into that. Clearly, I think, the overall turnout, I think what the polls got right was it was measuring Biden support and it was measuring Democrat support in this. But I think a lot of those late breaking voters were for Trump or for Republicans as well.
Anyone else want to jump in?
You were asking, right, Clyde, about the, the people saying that Trump made inroads with non-white voters?
Yeah, and whether there's been a kind of depolarization, because I think the trend for the last two decades is a racial polarization within the parties, with more non-white voters leaning Democratic and more white voters leaning Republican.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is that, again, I really encourage people to look at the demographics state by state, region by region. Also, of course, with the caveat about Latinos, that we're talking about different Latinos. So in Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, did Trump make gains with Latinos in that region? Yes. Did Biden still win the majority of Latinos in that region? Yes. And also the Rio Grande Valley accounts for some 15% of the Latino electorate in Texas. The rest of it, in a lot of the other, around the bigger cities, went overwhelmingly for Biden, and they grew their margins there as well. So I think providing the correct context is needed when looking at how much these gains were with Trump, and whether, even the big question that I think we'll all have entering the next cycles is, are those voters in the Rio Grande Valley going to stick with Republicans, or is it a Trump effect? And do they stay there beyond that, or Democrats, if they actually pay attention, because let's be honest, Biden did not pay attention to Texas. The Democratic Party did not pay attention to Texas this cycle. So if they were to actually pay attention to those different regions in that state, would they swing backwards, or swing back to Democrats?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was just my final thought was just in terms of like the polarization, or in terms of the non-white, white divide. I mean, if you look, Democrats are still winning the vast majority of non-white voters across states. Clearly, they see some little warning signs in what Trump was able to do in certain states and certain regions with different demographics. But yes, Republicans are trying to push this idea that they are now the multiracial coalition. And I don't think so far the data backs that up. Of course, again, as we've all noted, we still don't have a lot of the individual voter data, and we most likely won't have the clearest picture until, February, March of next year.
I was just going to say quickly, I think there's somewhat of a risk of like Trump beating expectations to us, extrapolating it into this magical political sauce. I mean, the man lost, and he lost from an incumbent position that still was not enough to call back. And so whatever kind of coalition Republicans are talking about, it was certainly an insufficient one. And I think what we see across the board is that the numbers that they were talking about among non-white communities, among Black voters, among Black men were not reached. I mean, the week before the election, they were telling us things like 25% of Black men. One, that's still not a majority. Two, that's not even what we're thinking we're seeing here. So even so, there was a small dip in, in the states that we know, there was a decrease in share of Black voters, or in certain places, Black turnout did not reach its extreme heights. Black turnout was still up in a lot of these states. It just didn't go up to the same degree as some other populations went up, which changes that overall share. So I think that we can, we need to place these things in context, but we should not give kind of Trump and Republicans more credit just by beating expectations from what we know to be a polling error. They certainly did his job in terms of turnout and creating voters that we did not see in the type of polling that we were relying on going in. Was that enough? Was that kind of the position that we were talking about Trump being in before this? Absolutely, no way.
So I want to circle back to COVID-19 and the impact that it had on the elections. Laura, I know you did a big piece for Politico where you went into Black and brown communities to talk to them about, how this disease has disproportionately, affected them, whether it's our health or, economic wise, them losing their businesses, or having their place of work shut down because of restrictions. When you talk to people in these communities, were they making political connections at all, as far as being upset with local leaders, or blaming the president or Congress for what was going on?
I would say some were and some weren't, which is that some were so just overwhelmed in the immediate spikes by what was occurring, by what was happening in their communities, that they weren't necessarily, thinking the election. Because I'm talking about spikes when they happened in April, or in May. But again, I'm going to go back to Arizona just because, I was on the ground there and I also covered that state a lot this cycle. And voters there, Latino voters there that I spoke to definitely were frustrated by the governor siding with Trump and deciding not to institute, certain mask mandates. And you saw it in polling. Now, I know the polling wasn't always entirely accurate, but you saw that Trump did take hits when the spikes were occurring in Arizona, when the COVID spikes were occurring. So, and I think it also impacted the seniors in Arizona, which is that many were frustrated by the fact that Trump didn't wear a mask, that there was no coherent national message. So do I think COVID definitely influenced a number of these voters? Yes. Did it have the impact that many of us expected it to have on the electorate? I don't think so, given what now we've seen in terms of how Trump was able to also increase, his vote share. But yeah, I would say that COVID certainly factor in for some Black and brown voters. And then their economy and their job situation impacted by COVID was one of the other big factors.
And I want to point out that COVID also had an impact just because in some ways, well, in a lot of ways, it changed how elections were carried out. You had expanded access to mail-in balloting, and you had Democrats emphasizing mail-in balloting in a way that they hadn't in the past. And it showed that in many ways, when you make it easier to vote, you get better turnout. And that's something we're going to grapple with, because I think a lot of people think it's prudent to not go back to the old way and to keep some of these innovations like the drop-off boxes for ballots and expanded early voting in states that didn't have those things before. And so those weren't COVID directly, but some of those indirect COVID benefits definitely impacted the election, because we saw in places like Georgia that the Democratic Party took advantage of this wider access and use it to turn out their voters. But I do think, to Laura's point, there were, for COVID, it reinforced for a lot of voters what they thought about Donald Trump. So for those who already were questioning his decision-making and felt that he didn't have a plan and he didn't have a vision, and then especially when he had COVID himself and continued to not wear a mask and continued to spread disinformation, I think it just reinforced for some people, it reinforced that they did not believe he was the right leader for America. But you also had people who it reinforced other things because it fed into kind of the Trump mysticism. And, he was driving through outside of Walter Reed and saying he was looking strong and all of that stuff. And so for those who kind of that Trump is a personality that people really hold on to, I think COVID for them just kind of reinforced that. So it fell both ways.
Jessica, did you see anything in the data around that?
I am muted. I think that as Tia said, the Democrats were seizing on the mail-in ballots to get their voters out. And you had the Republican Secretary of State there who's been under fire for carrying out the election, say that if the Trump campaign had just embraced mail-in voting and tried to get people out, like he could have won closer states. And I heard that from Senate Republicans. I heard that from Senate strategists, that were very worried about the effect that Trump's rhetoric was having on the decreasing mail-in ballots, and that they really worried that especially it's just risky to bring it down to election day. What if there was bad weather? What if there was people got sick? Now there was good weather across the country, and so I think that probably helped Republicans turn out their voters that they won on election day. But there is a question of whether, Republicans really fear that this has been a Pandora's box that's been opened up, that they sort of, and I think that's why you saw a lot of them, many admitted to me as much, that's why they were hesitant to sort of allow, wider access of absentee voting and especially mail-in voting, because they think that it's something that Democrats have an upper hand on. Well, they're all an upper hand on it as long as Republicans don't embrace it. So it's sort of, you have to adapt with the changes, because there's other, Republican states like Montana that had all mail-in voting, and other states that have done it for some time, that, are likely to stick with it perhaps. I mean, we've seen other states, Colorado and, Washington, adapt to it and stuff too. So I think this is why we are a system of, federalism, and that each states can make their own decisions and stuff too. But I think the Trump campaign really made a miscalculation with just sort of painting everything with a broad brush and saying that all of this is fraud, when you need those people seniors, when you need people that are afraid to leave their house or to stand in line to vote, to take advantage of this.
Mm-hmm. Tia, I want to address this question specifically to you, because you cover Capitol Hill, but anyone, please, feel free to jump in. What do you think the impact of not passing another coronavirus relief package had on the elections, both at the congressional level and at the presidential level?
I think it hurt. I think it hurt President Trump. Again, it's indicative of the lack of a national strategy, a national vision. It's a lack of leadership on coronavirus, because he missed an opportunity to be able to show American people what his administration had done to ensure they had resources and assistance, especially closer to Election Day. The last coronavirus relief package, I think, was back in May. They haven't been able to do anything since then. And so that gridlock, it could have been a win, especially if President Trump had gotten involved and said, hey, House and Senate, McConnell, come on, get it together. Let's do something. But he never did. Mnuchin was there, but they were not able to get anything across the finish line. But I also think it hurt incumbents on both sides of the aisle. Just that gridlock, again, it's not just the specific legislation that did not pass. It's what it reinforces about what people believe about Congress and gridlock and partisanship, and how Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and all those folks you see on TV aren't able to get it together to help the people you see in your everyday life who are losing their jobs and whose kids are getting on their nerves because everybody's at home and it's a mess, right? And that's what is disheartening about DC gridlock. And so I don't think it benefits anyone, but I think the person who could have benefited the most from coronavirus relief would have been President Trump if they were able to do it closer to an election day, and if his administration was able to demonstrate that they were had been involved in getting something over the finish line.
Estelle, you had a very interesting interview with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I think, was it the day after they called that the election was called for Joe Biden?
It was the same day.
Same day. And in it, it really, I guess, laid out the tension and the conflict within the Democratic Party going forward. All of it stemmed from this big post-election call that the Democratic caucus had, where you had some moderate Democrats kind of casting aspersion on their more progressive members of the caucus, saying, they underperformed expectations because of defund the police and the protests. Could you just talk about the conflict going forward within the Democratic Party, and your takeaways from that interview with AOC, and as it relates to the protests and some of the police reform movements.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we saw through the summer and from the nominee was Joe Biden really putting together an electoral coalition that was a kind of choose your own adventure. If you were progressive, you could say, oh, this guy's gonna be open to my issue. If you were John Kasich or a moderate or former Republican or Cindy McCain, you can say, oh, he's a kind of moderate, ideological person who's center of growth, who's gonna keep the progressives at their side. I think about the day at the DNC where both those visions were put on the table, and even though they are in conflict, but what that is not is a governing coalition. That is not, both sides of that coin can't be true for Joe Biden as he seeks to lead the party. And so what we now see, I think, happening is those people saying, hey, which side are you going to choose? And the answer might be a little bit of both, right? You can still try to lead on one issue from the left to come to the center on another. But what we also see is a House and a congressional leadership that was shocked by the results, who expected to pick up seats in Congress, who had kind of dreamed of a unified House and Senate. And so when that didn't happen, and the fire was trained on the left to say, oh, these issues from the summer, I think what happened in that interview was a Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez who wanted to shoot back, who wanted to say that that's not how she saw the race, and that's also more largely not where she sees the central tension among the party. She says that frankly, the moderates ran bad races, that it's a party that's not good at kind of digital organizing and investing kind of where the battle is being won. And you've seen that critique be amplified by folks like Doug Jones, who lost out in Alabama, and even by some other members of Congress who aren't on that progressive side. But you have the moderates pushing back, saying that it is a message problem, and that no matter if it is fair or unfair, right or wrong, the path to political power for Democrats goes through these communities, goes through those frontline districts, goes through those gerrymandered House districts that are overwhelmingly white and Republican leaning, and that they have to cater to those folks or they'll be pushed back by Republicans. I mean, that's going to be the question before Joe Biden, both in cabinet appointments and in that kind of first 100-day agenda, is how is he going to consensus build? But like Joe Biden himself is someone who has played both sides of that coin, who has been someone who has kept away from progressives on some things and tried to call himself an incoming FDR in other places. I think that is what we're going to have to see is kind of over the next year, whose vision of him is correct. And then more so than that, is he movable to be able to create consensus either between different wings of the party or across both sides of the aisle?
If I could just add a few things, Clyde.
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about some of these House districts, which maybe everyone knows who's joining us, but a lot of them were Trump districts. So they're ones that Trump won that were always going to be very difficult for Democrats to keep. And like Ested said, Democrats did not help themselves by setting this expectation game that they were going to win, more seats rather than lose any. But Abigail Spanberger, who is from Virginia and the one that was on the call who blamed defund, who blamed socialism, she barely won her seat in 2018. And I covered her closely in 2018. And the expectation that she was going to easily win in 2020 was, I think, misguided. And maybe she never held it, but it was always going to be a very difficult race for her, for the Connor Lambs, for the Max Roses of the world. And Max Rose ultimately lost. And he actually had a really interesting speech on election night where he stood by his decision to join Black Lives Matter protesters and said that it was the right thing to do, even though he was attacked by the Republican over and over again on defund. One of the big questions I have is that aside from anecdotes from these lawmakers is I think that the data is still outstanding on whether or not it was exactly defund that was the death knell to them, or a combination of factors that led to this. And so that's, of course, why you're hearing members like Ocasio-Cortez, and then I spoke to Rashida Tlaib as well last week, and she was very frustrated and actually became emotional on the call by what was unfolding in the Democratic caucus in the days since the election. And as Ested said, I mean, yeah, I think that Biden, definitely, we aren't sure where he's going to come down on these issues. Police reform is going to be one of the toughest things for him, I think, because he, as it is, his proposal is not even in line with the House Democratic bill that was passed earlier this year. And his campaign has said they don't necessarily agree with all of the things in that bill. So things like ending qualified immunity outright, we could see particular, aggressive battles emerge around that bill and different policy elements of it.
I mean, go ahead, Tia.
I was just going to give a quick perspective because Georgia is an outlier in this conversation because Georgia had 2 toss-up races and Democrats won both. So you had Lucy McBath, who narrowly won in 2018. She was in a rematch this year against the same Republican she unseated in 2018. And she won despite that Republican saying Lucy McBath wants to defund the police and saying she supported rioters in the street. Those attacks did not work on Lucy McBath, but I think the difference is, even though gerrymandering exists, the demographics have overpowered the gerrymandering. And then in the 7th district, which is also suburban Atlanta, it's also a district that used to be held by a Republican. I think it's the one seat nationally that Democrats took the seat from Republican hands, but it wasn't an incumbent that was unseated. So again, there you had a toss-up race, but the Democrat won. But again, it shows that the demographics of the district matter a lot because it's a district that has almost become impossible. Well, you got to be a really bad Democrat to lose in this district now because the demographics have changed so much. So I do think, as both Ested and Laura said, we really need to look at the makeup of these districts and wonder if some of it just wasn't Democrats underestimating the cycle. They picked up a lot of seats in the midterm because that's what happens in the midterm. You know what I mean? And so it's harder to do that in a presidential election, especially when turnout's super high. There just might have been some miscalculations that don't have as much to do with messaging. But I just think there are a lot of unanswered questions out there.
I think Democrats definitely learned that big turnout doesn't necessarily mean a Democratic win inherently. And I also, because Trump was able to squeeze out some more of those conservative voters. But I also think when we think about Joe Biden, the choice isn't just ideology, moderate versus progressive, and where to go. I mean, think about his own primary campaign. There was 2 sides of Joe Biden. There was nothing will fundamentally change, as he told donors in one fundraiser, and there's Build Back Better. There is, I'm going to embrace kind of large scale messaging once he gets to the general election. There's return to normal Joe Biden that just removed Trump and he's an aberration. And there's expansive thought. And so that's the kind of first question I think we'll get an answer to. It's just how much this administration is interested in going back to a pre-Trump vision of how kind of Washington and politics will work, or is interested in kind of stepping in to meet the kind of big crises that face the country and what scope will they take. That'll be a big question of who their even congressional partners are also.
Is it, Erica, is it time for the Q&A, or do we have more time? It is, okay. So we'll now start the question and answer portion. Please just drop your question in the chat and I will read it to the room. And if you're addressing it for a specific panelist, make sure to mention that as well. Okay, our first question. Research shows that while Congress has become more classically polarized, ideologically extreme, the general public has been increasingly sorted, liberals identifying as Democrats, conservatives as Republicans, but there is little evidence that the same type of classical ideological polarization, at least as of 2015. Does this distinction strike you as holding true post-2016, or have members of the public become more ideologically extreme as well?
I I think at least when we're looking at elections, that they've become almost parliamentary, especially when we look at the Senate races. In 2016, every single Senate race went the same way as the presidential election did in their state. And so far in 2020, depending upon those two Georgia runoffs, but Maine's Susan Collins is the only one that was able to outperform Trump enough to win. And, she was underestimated in the polls very clearly. And I think that shows that if some states are just different too, like Maine, you pretty much have to be there. And I think, you all at the Times just posted a very good story sort of about the idiosyncrasies of the state, and that despite the fact that Sarah Gideon had lived there for 14 years, she wasn't seen as from there. And so I think there are different states, but I think that a lot of it just comes down to, we see very little ticket splitting. And while I think that, we saw a muddled presidential versus a muddled congressional and Senate take, though, I don't think there's going to be that much difference when we look at the House seats necessarily. And there's certainly not going to be very much different when we look at the top line results in the Senate races. And certainly some of the seats that Democrats were targeting, they were betting on people splitting their tickets more than they did in South Carolina, in Montana, in Kansas, and that didn't come to fruition. And so the margin that I think you have to have as ticket splitters is just becoming harder and harder to overcome. And, while that may not be their ideological persuasion, if you drill down into people, we can only really look at how they vote at the ballot box, really, though.
Okay, and I want to acknowledge that first question was from Bear Brown from The Ohio State University. Next question from Nicole Messer of University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. How can we move forward with disinformation impacting the perceived legitimacy of the election?
I'll jump in on that one, since Georgia is currently ground zero for just that. And it's interesting because in Georgia, you have Republicans delegitimizing a Republican-led election process, which is different than what we would expect, where, that it falls more along party lines. And again, it's a symptom of a bigger issue of misinformation and disinformation for political expediency. And it's something that I think all of us journalists are really concerned about, because people just, if you can't agree to the facts, you can't have a real debate. That's the building blocks of like democracy and all of that stuff. Is like, first you got to at least agree to the facts, then you can decide, what do you think is the right thing to do? So, right now the disinformation, conservative outlets in particular, not just the president, but conservative media that kind of feeds off of him and makes their money off of him in the culture that surrounds him, peddling disinformation for that reason. It's almost like propaganda. And the solution is finding sources that you trust, but there's an education that I think has to come. And a lot of people, I'm getting disheartened because a lot of people are too far gone. I'm sure all the journalists on this panel were getting emails and social media messages from people who are like, how dare you call the race for Joe Biden? There are still dead people voting, and there are still missing votes that are being suppressed, and all these things that are just not true, just made up. But these people, again, have been radicalized by the propaganda. And I don't know, I think it's going to take time and leadership. Again, unfortunately, our leader, our president, has peddled in the propaganda, and that doesn't help. And my hope and prayer is that leadership, not just at the presidency, but at all levels of government, kind of helps people get back to believing in facts and truth.
If I could just quickly add, to hammer home Tia's point is, for months, for the entire year, maybe before this entire year, Trump and his campaign surrogates were acting to delegitimize the election process. Lara Trump was on the trail saying that dead cats were voting. in the election, and that the only way, Trump would lose is because it's rigged. That has lasting impact. Also, the fact that Trump may not leave politics, that he may very well run again in 2024, is going to have a lasting impact. Another big question is, with a Joe Biden White House and a majority in the House, we don't know what the Senate's going to look like. What do they do? What can they do, legislatively or through regulations in terms of Facebook and big tech? So, because a lot of the disinformation is clearly prevalent because of social mediums. And we saw through this election the attempt by certain mediums to try to slap fact checks on the president, or cover some tweets and Facebook posts. But that's a big question moving forward, is what exactly do platforms like Facebook do to address this issue? Facebook has been known to, reports have shown that Facebook actually pushes forward, disinformation or right-wing media posts across the platform versus other more reputable outlets. So is that going to change? I mean, are they going to be pushed to change that? That's a big question moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Our next question is from Dean Farmer from the University of Kentucky. Go Wildcats. At what point do you this is a doozy. At what point do you expect Trump to concede the election? Is it politically advantageous for him to continue to refuse to accept results to rally his base? Or will his refusal to accept the election's results harm the Republican Party in the long run?
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I think that this is just harmful for democracy overall. And for people, that some Republicans making comparisons to 2000, it was one state and it was a couple hundred votes. Like, it is not the same. And he has now lost by the electoral margins are exactly flipped from what they were in 2016. And Hillary Clinton conceded the day after. And, so I think that, it is dangerous, I think, to set this precedent. And then you also have what I think it could be more harmful. And, Tia can probably speak to this better than I can, is that you have those two Georgia races that are contingent upon, that are going to determine the Senate majority. But then you also have Republicans talking about how it is going to determine the Senate majority, but that's only true if you have Biden as the president. So it's sort of a little bit of double talk there. And I think that, his base is going to continue, because they've seen him continue to claim that these are illegitimate and it was false. And that's just, I mean, we've already seen, I think, dangerous rises that's been fueled by social media, like Laura talked about, of extremism and different things, and that takes root in there. And so I think it's harmful for democracy, and it could be harmful for the Republican Party in those races in Georgia too.
Trump's refusal to concede is a kind of tip of an iceberg of a larger and deeper democratic erosion that is, happening right now. I mean, whether or not he engages in that formality, you have an entire apparatus of media and lawmakers who are not even pushing him to, who are not even inspiring trust in our system, and more so than that, are attacking it for their political gain. And so whether or not we think it is good for them to attack the system to rally their base, Republicans have already made the determination that that is what they think they need to do to rally the base. And so that is going to be the kind of truth of what happens, at least until the Georgia runoff. I mean, I would say that it's my opinion that you can't just roll this stuff back. It's not as if you engage in this level of attack on the system and then you wake up the next day and say, psych, actually the system's good. This is going to be a real kind of long-term fight that is waged upon kind of who gets a voice in our democracy. And that's not going to change whether Donald Trump concedes today or concedes next month. It is going to be a kind of larger and more guttural question that America is going to have to ask itself, because it is, because at this point, whether we want to, as right before this call happened, the Wayne County Board in Detroit refused to certify the results on the 2-2 party vote. Republicans just used to certify the results there, even though there's no evidence of fraud or misdeed. And so this is going to be a top to bottom check on our system, and there's no telling how that goes.
Yeah, to follow up on that, you had Lindsey Graham, calling around to secretaries of state in some of these close states today. So,
and appeared to lie about the fact that he was talking to secretaries of state.
And then Kamala Harris on the Senate floor and congratulated her. So,
The next question, it might be the last, I think, from Matthew Felstein from Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. How do you think a one-term Trump presidency will affect the Republican primaries in 2024?
Well, Trump may run in 2024.
Yeah, it's gonna freeze the field probably.
Which I think he totally could. I don't think we can say he's out. Of course, to do that, he has to concede that. Well, he doesn't have to concede, but he has to, leave the White House and in a roundabout way admit that he lost this election. The Republican primaries in 2024. I mean, if Trump is in it, I think that's where it goes. The party goes with him. I mean, you don't see any severances that Stead laid out, as Jessica laid out. Like, there's no this idea that there would be some kind of clean cut from Republicans and Trump. I mean, the Republican Party is the Trump party, and Trumpism is Republicanism. So the idea that there would be some clean cut, I'm not sure anyone thought that there would be, but it's just, the Republican Party clearly isn't even in a reflection process right now, right? Despite the election results, despite the fact that they lost the White House, there is no reflecting among the Republican Party right now. You have the House Minority Leader just outright refusing to say that Joe Biden won the election, and validating and just repeating these baseless claims that Trump and the White House are making. I don't really know how to handle what the primary would look like, especially if Trump is in it.
But I think even if Trump doesn't run, that there's going to be, if Trump doesn't run and if Trump is still around, because we don't know how some of his legal and financial issues are going to play out once he's out of the White House. But let's say he comes out unscathed and he's still around to do whatever he wants in 2024. Even if he doesn't run, he can have a big voice and influence on Republican politics, and therefore a lot of influence on whoever, the trajectory of that primary season, even if he's not one of the candidates.
The real short-term losers here are the other 2024 candidates, the Tom Cottons, the Nikki Haley's, the people who expected to be in Iowa and New Hampshire over the next couple of weeks. I don't know how they did not see that 4 years of telling the party that the only thing that mattered with Donald Trump would actually end up with the only thing that matters is Donald Trump. But that's where they are. They can't campaign. They can't get donors. They can't kind of start the runs that they were expecting to, because it all depends on what Donald Trump is going to do. And that's the situation they create.
I know I'm not a panelist, but just to piggyback on that, I mean, it really is incredible, because it's not like Donald Trump would, he's going to flirt with it. It's not like he's going to make a declarative sermonist statement about whether he's going to run it out, because he loves the attention. And, poor Ted Cruz, who's just swallowed all this stuff for 4 years. All these other people, like Estad said, are just on the sidelines waiting on Trump. Like, will he, won't he? And they can't get off the ground because they wouldn't dare, take him on, because he's probably going to still have the love of the base. I just had to add that in there. I just think it's such an incredible scenario for 2024. Wait, Jessica, did you want to add?
I just, same thing that Estad said, all of you all. I mean, I think it's, I laughed that we said that, but it's so true, because my dog Smokey has a lot of thoughts on this as well, as you can hear him. that these people have done everything to prove their fealty to him. And even after 2016, when, you know, he essentially claimed that Ted Cruz's father had murdered JFK, all of these crazy things. And so they did everything. They, you know, proved their fealty. And then now it's, what is it for if they can't run in 2024? So yeah, I mean, and you know, if you read some of the fine print on the donations that he's trying to accept for his, you know, legal victory fund, it's for a super PAC too. So that enables him to continue to tour out there, to hold events. Like, he's not going to have a traditional post-presidency as we see presidents, even one-term presidents that leave office like Jimmy Carter and devote themselves to humanitarian missions that arguably perhaps had a better post-presidency than his 4 years of the presidency. Certainly a more impactful one perhaps, but he's not going to do that. He's never been a traditional politician, and I think he's going to continue to dangle that carrot out there as long as he can, and he's going to love every single minute of it.
Yeah, well, I think that does it on questions, right, Erica?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you all so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. I know that you could be doing many other things with your Tuesday night, so thank you for spending it with us. I hope all of you get some sleep, get well rested, maybe not because of the Georgia specials, but or the Georgia runoffs. But we really thank you for all that you do, and thank you for being here with us. And Clyde, thank you so much for leading us through an excellent conversation.